Hi, friends. I think we're probably ready to get started and join in this amazing opportunity to learn from Anat Hoffman and Noah Sattath, the executive director and directors of the Israel Religion Action Center, who do so much work. They're both heroic leaders, helping Israel to be a pluralistic society, to be the best country it can be, and to ultimately fulfill the Torah's vision of being an Or LaGoyim, helping us be a light unto the nations. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Singer, and I'm so honored to be part of this conversation from the Congregation Emanu-El San Francisco. But our program is sponsored, of course, by Iraq, and then Artsa, Artsenu, and Domim. And we're so glad to have you all join us here. We do want you to know the conversation is being recorded and will be available afterwards. And subtitles will be released in the next few days for those who want to engage in that fashion. And they're going to speak for a few minutes and answer questions, an Israeli few minutes, so it'll be a little more than that. And then if you want to have a question, please go ahead and put the questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them. But boy, it's been a crazy, amazing time. And so I want to start out by just asking the two of you the question that I think is on everyone's mind. We just had the fourth election in 2 years. And so we all want to know, when is the fifth election going to be? Because Oigevalt, it's clear that it's not clear. So what happened just now with the results? What do you learn? Really, the real question, I think, is what's on the average Israeli's mind today? What is the electorate telling you and telling us who so care about Israel about how they responded? What are Israelis thinking? And what can you tell us about the division of the country, the fact that Likud lost 300,000 votes from the last time around? What's on Israel's mind?
So let me start, and I will answer the question, how did we get here? And Rabbi Sattath will answer the question, what can we learn from this? And as for your opening, and I thank you and all the sponsors, you said that we should be a light unto the nations. Jonathan, let the nations get their own electrician. We are barely lighting this place on our own. Yes, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, but it is a dysfunctional democracy. This frequency of elections is not a sign of health. So for those of you who are not in the know, I'd like to remind you that there are 9.3 million Israelis. 6.5 million of them have the right to vote, and 4.4 million actually used that right and voted yesterday. Basically, we're divided between Democratic and Jewish, meaning of the 13 parties that ran in this election, clearly some of them see themselves as absolutely Jewish parties aimed at making Israel more Jewish. I assess that around 1 million of the voters, meaning a quarter of the 4.4 million who voted for religious reasons only. And the brand of Judaism that developed in Israel is a strain that is dark and very different from that you have over there in San Francisco. It is a religion that I would devote the rest of my life to try to change. Anyway, there is a ideological difference between people who believe in a halachic state, a state that would be run according to orthodoxy, and those of us who believe in a democratic state. But there's also another reason for the election, and that is Netanyahu, our prime minister's desire not to face the natural consequences of some of his folly. Maybe you are unaware that on the 21st of November 2019, our prime minister was charged with bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. If he is indicted on all 3 counts, he will face 19 years in an Israeli prison. This is no small thing. And he does, basically it's about criminal exchange with tycoons of different kinds. And the prime minister claims that this is all a scheme, a plot. The police has invented this. The Justice Department invented this. The press has invented this. This is all a plot against his policies. But the result of his tactics is that that Netanyahu's government basically went through 5 years as a temporary government, the longest temporary government in Israel's history. 4 parliaments were changed, and this government still continued. Why did we get to this election? Well, there is an automatic device that disperses the Knesset, the parliament, if the budget is not passed. And 9 months ago, the government headed by Netanyahu refused to pass the budget, and automatically new elections were announced. Why did Netanyahu not ratify the 2020 budget? And as a result, we had to go to elections again. The reason is that he had an agreement with Mr. Gantz. Remember Mr. Gantz? Had 33 seats in the Knesset. That on the 17th of November, 2021, Mr. Gantz will become Prime Minister of Israel. Mr. Netanyahu added to this agreement with Gantz a landmine. The landmine was that if there will be no budget, the Knesset will disperse. And since it was up to Netanyahu to pass the budget, he didn't pass the budget. The landmine went off. Mr. Gantz is not going to be in rotation with Mr. Netanyahu, and a new election happened. I believe that Mr. Netanyahu denied us a budget and pushed us to a 4th election because this is helpful for him in avoiding the consequences of these 3 counts. And maybe I should mention that today the Supreme Court of Israel ruled that it is the Attorney General that will decide what issues Mr. Netanyahu is not allowed to deal with anymore. And the 11 judges said that Mr. Netanyahu, you told us that you will allow the Attorney General to decide that you are not going to interfere in issues of the Justice Department, issues of police, and issues of media. You promised this to the court. You have not lived up to this. And this morning's ruling is that the Attorney General is going to decide to stop Netanyahu from dealing with these issues. I don't know if you get the gist of it, but we are a sick puppy, the way an American idiom goes. And Israel sorely needs a viable, solid, but government that is absolutely committed to democratic values. What can we learn from all this, Rabbi Sattath?
So if we're looking at what we have, all votes have been counted, and in the last hour we have the final results. And I want to put the results in context globally. Around the world, democracies are under attack. In Israel, the specific context is around Netanyahu's trial, but all over the world, we're seeing constitutions suspended, Supreme Courts closed, papers being closed. And the same attacks are happening in Israel and are happening fiercely for the past decade, and much more so in the past 3 years. And what we saw in the results that we had today is that despite all these efforts, the democratic structure is standing. Thanks to our activists, thanks to our politicians, thanks to our judges, the structure still stands. And that's something that we should not take for granted. Netanyahu does not have a government that will suspend Israeli democracy currently. But on the other hand, we see that the anti-democratic forces in Israel are very strong, and we have not defeated them. Democratic forces alone do not have the power to assemble the government either, which means that the struggle for Israeli democracy is continuing. And unlike in the US, where anti-democratic forces were politically defeated, even though they continue to exist, here the political struggle continues fiercely. And that's the struggle of our time. This is the struggle for the soul of Israel. And this is what we're here to do.
Well, with that in mind, Rabbi Sattath, I think a lot of Americans were surprised that they didn't understand the complexity of our own system, of how the Electoral College could be challenged in the Congress if certain things occurred. And we've looked at the Israeli system as being uber complex. There's never been a majority government ever. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is going to happen in terms of how possible coalitions might be formed as going forward? I think you might have a tool that you can share with us.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the first thing that's important to always keep in mind is that the Israeli government, since 1981, no Israeli government has completed a full term. Every week, the government is challenged. And so in order to build a government, the prime minister, the head of one of the big parties, has to both create a tool. It's from the Haaretz website. If you want to support Israeli democracy, other than supporting Iraq, subscribe to Haaretz. It's one of our very important democratic institutions. And here we can see the calculator. You need 61 members to assemble a government. So here's what it would look like if we're trying to establish a left-wing government. We are 5 members short. And this would be a government that will go from being the Arab Nationalist Party, from the Arab National Party to the Israel Beitenu right-wing party. It's an extremely diverse government that is very, very hard to keep alive for a long time. If we're looking at the right-wing Orthodox government, which will be comprised of Likud and Shas and other parties, they are two Knesset members short. So there's no side that can form a government. The only way to form a government is using the new Arab party called Ra'am, which is an Islamist party that broke away from the joint Arab list. So with the Arab party, the Netanyahu government can have a coalition with 64 members. The Islamist party did not rule out sitting with Netanyahu, although they did not rule that in. But that would have to be a government that goes from Islamist to Kahanist. It's a very, very diverse government. It's unclear that they can start together. For sure, they cannot last long together. If we're looking at the left wing, if the Ra'am party, the Islamist party, joins the center left, then we have a government that as 61, it's a very, very fragile government that goes from Israel Beitenu, which is a right-wing party, to the Islamist party. It's a very, very diverse government. And Ra'am, which is the Islamist party, is not progressive in any means. So the common ground is very shaky. So in all analysis, the most likely result is another election. The timeline for election is around the fall, because there's a time for reestablishing a government. And even if we do anticipate a government on one side, one of the ways for every party now is trying to pull members from the other side to their side with bribes, with moral arguments, with all sorts of shenanigans that are going on here. I think that the likelihood of a government surviving 2021 and finishing 2022 are close to zero. But there is a small chance that a government will be established and will function for a short time before a fifth election is called. The goal of the center-left government would be to pass legislation that will prohibit a prime minister with indictments to serve, and the goal of a right-wing ultra-Orthodox government would be to pass legislation taking away powers from the Supreme Court so that Netanyahu doesn't have to stand trial.
Wow. Well, folks out in chat land, we have about 5 questions, and then we'll go to the chat. So don't worry. We're going to get to your questions. I do wonder, Noah and Anat, as I think about retirement investment, should I be investing in Israeli political advertising companies? It sounds like a growth industry out there. Now, the both of you have worked so hard for change and improving the status of liberal democracy, and you've had great success in the courts. But this time, again, with all the challenges out there, whatever happens in this Knesset, for the very first time, a Reform rabbi will be seated as a Chaver Knesset. Is that an amazing breakthrough that represents a change in terms of non-Orthodox acceptance on the part of the Israeli polity? Or is this a political anomaly that was just a one-time thing and we won't see it again for a while? What's the impact of having Gilad in the Knesset?
So let me just I will say a little bit about who Gilad is, and Rabbi Sattath will tell you what the significance is. So Gilad is a lawyer and a rabbi. He's 48 years old. He served in one of the elite units in the Israeli intelligence, the A200 unit. He was a very successful young officer. He is a vegan. He has 2 masters, one in law and one in Jewish thought. And he had his finger in every pot. He worked for freedom of choice in marriage and divorce in Israel. He helped single mothers. He fought for core curriculum for ultra-Orthodox boys. He fought the summer clock, so we will have more hours of daylight savings. He stopped racist incitement. He fought at the wall. He was a big ally of Women of the Wall. He fought against segregation of women. He tried to stop religious coercion in the army. He worked on a new vision of what Shabbat could be in the public sphere in Israel. He worked on publicizing Regina Jonas, the first Reform rabbi from Germany, her thesis. He got that translated and published in Hebrew. He had seriously a very long career in the issues of religion and state and freedom of conscience, and also shared society between Jews and Arabs. He's delicious. He's wonderful. And I will add one more important fact. He was born on November 30th, 1973, which is the day Ben Gurion died. That's no coincidence. Ben Gurion died. Gilad Kariv was born, both in Ramat Gan. So I give you Gilad Kariv. What a wonderful spokesman for our movement in the Knesset. And what does that mean, Noah?
So I want to analyze both what it means in terms of how we got here and the fact that Gilad has always been such an outspoken advocate for our movement first and foremost, and always identified as a Reform rabbi. And the fact that he got to such a high place in the primaries in the Labor Party is one more testament to the growing strength of our movement in Israel and the work of all of our rabbis and all of our congregations and all of our lay leaders in making inroads in Israel. And I think what it will mean for the future is with the partnership of Gilad Kariv, and you can see Merav Michaeli, who is the leader of the Labor Party and is a big supporter of Gilad. Moving forward, I think we will have advocates like we've never had in the Knesset in terms of who we are, in terms of our values, in terms of the focus on our goals and our values.
Well, how ironic that Gilad just got into the Knesset at the same time that a Meir Kahane racist party not only got in, but this time could be in the government, a party that was encouraged to come together by the prime minister himself. Like here with our attack on Congress and the sensibility that attack was the first, not the last. How at risk is Israeli democracy? How at risk is it marching away from North American Jewish community values, not to say centrist and left Israeli communal values?
So one of the symptoms of the democratic fragility is the extremist right ideas taking over the center right. And that's happening, again, all over the world, and it's certainly happening in Israel. And the dramatic move from when Likud in the 80s and the 90s worked to disqualify Kahanis and made sure the Likud prime minister made sure that nobody, when Kahana himself, the inventor of Jewish supremacy, spoke at the Knesset, no other Knesset members were attending. He has only spoken to an empty plenum. And now the Israeli prime minister is working to get Kahanis into the Knesset. That is a grave sign of the change that we're experiencing. And it is up to us to both be outspoken against this type of racist incitement. It's also up to our Israeli leaders from the left and the right to denounce this behavior, and I hope that they will. I also, I think that many of our listeners know about the Kahanis candidates. A new candidate that got in this election is the Noam party. Noam is a new party, which is part of the religious Zionist brand. And it is a party that focuses dramatically on the LGBT community and the reform movement. I want to show you their campaign, their ads in the campaign. So let's watch the movie and get back to the conversation. Hold on.
No sound.
No sound. Let me try again.
It's a little box there.
There we go.
Sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa. في مسألة متعلقة بقضية الحرب والسلام. أנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל.
יש אנשים, אבל שהם מגיעים למצעד הגאווה ויוצאים בכל שנה עם נזק בלתי הפיך.
So this is another testament in a weird way, in the same way that Gilad's election is a sign of the strength of our movement. The fact that there's a whole party dedicated to the struggle against reform Judaism in Israel is another testament to the growth of our movement and of our impact. But it certainly will impact many of our causes. One other target of the Noam party is the LGBT community, and this is one of the interesting new developments in the alliances of fundamentalists. So the Islamist party is also deeply, deeply homophobic, and they are very eager to collaborate with right-wing Orthodox extremists on the issue of working for anti-LGBT rights. So the LGBT issue is what split up the joint Arab list, creating this alliance between the Jewish right in Israel and the Arab right.
So you really are talking then about different people suddenly willing to have dinner together, so to speak, who never would have been in the same room, right? That the idea that the new Mansour Abbas's party, you're saying, would be willing to be in coalition with the Zionist maximalist parties at the same time. Is that possible? And at the same time, people asking in the chat, is Yamina willing to be in coalition with the left and form a center government as opposed to center-left government?
That's a good question. Both options are possible. It's possible that I want to share the screen with Mansour Abbas. Mansour Abbas, who is the leader of the Ram party that broke away from the Joint Arab List. He's a dentist, and what he is saying is, our leaders have been taking a principled stand for Palestinian nationality for years, and I want to be like the ultra-Orthodox. I'm going to go with anybody who gives me the most. I don't want to take, I'm going to bargain. I'm going to be part of this game. I don't want to say it's corrupt anymore. I want in. And he is very, very conservative in his views against women, against the LGBT community. And the question is whether he can sit with Kahanists. Today, both the Kahanists said they wouldn't sit with him, and he said he wouldn't sit with the Kahanists. But if we at Iraq had $1 for every time that a politician said that they wouldn't sit with somebody and they did, we would need to do a lot less fundraising. so it's very hard to tell. In terms of Yamina, again, Bennett made very firm commitments against working with the left and certainly working with the Joint Arab List. But he could go back from these statements as well.
I think I want you to remind Bennett when you see him that his parents were members of our synagogue here in San Francisco.
Okay.
That they are proud Reform Jews, and he should take a second look at his past as he tries to build the future. But speaking of building the future, Anat, there was a major protest movement for democracy that took place. Is that movement growing? Did they show up to the polls? Do they give you hope? What do the two of you say about that? I think the numbers were astronomical, actually, who turned out. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, some of our staff members, in fact, the head of our development, Karen, was there for 3 years, every week, and she actually slept there at night and kept the fire going, brought her children. It's such a total commitment. She and thousands of others standing on bridges, standing in crossroads, holding signs that became shorter and shorter. In the beginning, it was stop corruption. Then it just went down to one word, lech. Lech, you know it from lech lecha? Lech means get away, go, lech. And you see lech in every, lech has become the code word for making Netanyahu face his trial, focusing on his trial. You can't fight for your 3 times a week. The trial is going to need his presence. How can you run a country while you're on trial? So yeah, it really is. Israel took to the streets for a long, long time. It was very impressive.
Noah,
what does it mean?
Yeah, talk about the numbers for a minute, Noah.
In terms of the protest movement?
You said there's a huge protest. I don't know if our listeners are...
So last Saturday night, we had 70,000 people next to the Prime Minister's home in Israel. If we want to compare it to American numbers, I know that not all of our viewers are from America, but let's do that. So you have to multiply that by 25 times. So that would be a 3 million person protest in US numbers in terms of how big it was. Wow. And what a big segment of the Israeli population was there. Wow.
So that is fascinating. Now we have a new administration here in the United States. And again, his power is borderline. It's enough to make a difference. So two questions. What's the effect on Israel of having this new administration, that we're in perhaps a post-Trump era in this country, certainly in terms of how Israel is engaged from the United States? And then the follow-up, and we'll go to the larger group questions, is will people join together for a short period to change the system of government and then let themselves fall apart again? But first deal with the new Biden administration, the new Secretary of State. What are your thoughts?
So there's a famous Israeli joke about the Minister of Agriculture coming to Levi Eshkol, our Prime Minister, in the 70s and saying, there's a big drought and it's a huge risk for us. And Eshkol saying, really, where is it? And the Minister of Agriculture saying, well, it's in the north, it's destroying all the crops. And then Diane saying, I thought you were talking about the US. And the significance of US politics on Israel is immense. It always has been. We've seen in our system where we have no constitution and very weak separation between the different branches of government, we always see the Supreme Court and the justice system as our first barrier of defense, and then the press. And the third type of check and balance that we have always had is the American administration, which is such a close ally to Israel. And that has been devastated during the Trump years for us in terms of the unleashing of anti-democratic forces and the erosion of all of our democratic norms. So we are very hopeful that now that you have made such a big difference and won for democracy in your country, that will have an effect here. And if we're thinking about what we've gained in these 2 years of election after election after election for the Democratic camp in Israel, the new U.S. administration is the number one element that we have gained in this time.
Wow. Well, I'm going to go to some of the questions then. Okay. In Haaretz today, a writer writes, a commentator said that the central issue in this election was Netanyahu, not COVID, not the economy, not social justice, not Orthodox hegemony over Israeli life versus religious pluralism, not the conflict of the Palestinians or the relationship with the US. It was Netanyahu. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. It's the only thing that Israelis talk about, and having this authoritarian leaders have an amazing power in this time of fake news, in this time of social media, and the strength that Netanyahu has and his way of leadership is really what is dividing people in Israel between people who support that way of government and are inspired by a strong leader and think that that's what's important, and people who have other values. And so that's what's tearing Israeli society apart. Of course, Israel has been impacted by COVID and by other issues in this year, but that is still the central issue.
So does that make Gideon Sa'ar, is that his name? Does that make him suddenly a fan of the center left?
Gideon Sa'ar, Anat, why don't you share your thoughts about Gideon Sa'ar?
Yeah, my thoughts are that I thought that Gideon Sa'ar would do a lot better because he embodies the original values of the Likud. He really is the original Likud, and he had on his list Benny Begin, the son of Menachem Begin. So it was clear that Netanyahu changed the DNA of the party, very much the way Trump changed the DNA of the Republican Party. But suddenly here is like the true Republican running. And it looked like people did not vote for the original. The DNA has deeply changed, and people voted for Netanyahu. But just reminding you, Netanyahu went into this election with 36 mandates and ended up with 30, lost 300,000 votes.
Wow. So following up on Gilad for a moment, either one of you. All right, we go to the fifth election. Will he have a high position on the labor slate or not?
No. The question is, would someone remember that he was a member of Knesset? Will he? Hopefully, yes. But this, I think the person who asked the question asked, would his seat be reserved? Is he a shoo-in for the next election? Mm-hmm. The answer is no. He's going to have to work very hard in this Knesset, even if it's short-lived, to make a mark so that labor voters will again vote for him.
All right. So Noah, you talked about when we talk about what we say publicly versus what we're not going to do. And then as in the Tom Cruise movie, they show them the money. Will they change their position? And so there's a question, will Israel Beitenu say, you know what, we're tired of sitting outside. I'm going to suck it up and go back in that right-wing government?
So there's no absolute answer to that. But first of all, I want to say that we at IRAC have a relationship with with really a very wide range of parties, and we regularly meet with Israel Beitenu and Israel Beitenu leadership. Last meeting we had with them was a month ago. I was very impressed with their determination not to work with Netanyahu again. I think they are feeling strong in the opposition. And I think Lieberman is unlikely to do that. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely to do that. I want to share that we met with him with Rick Jacobs before the third elections, and Rick asked him, Rabbi Rick Jacobs asked him, how many elections will you have? So Lieberman, who's very famous for having no facial expressions and no changes in his intonation, said, you will have to keep voting until you vote right. So I think that's what he's going for. He's going to make us go vote again and again until we get it right.
Wow. Well, speaking of voting, there was a question in the chat about the Israeli diaspora and their engagement with the elections. Were they able to vote? Did they have to fly back to the country to vote? And I guess maybe the underlying question is, did COVID change the outcome of the vote because they weren't able to come?
No will answer about COVID. I will answer about the numbers. So the numbers are that 4.4 out of 6.5 million voted. That is 2.1 million people did not use their voting right this time. Most of them live in Israel, but around 800,000 are in the world, and we're not able to vote because they're not here. There is no way to vote from abroad the way they do in the United States, except if you are sent abroad. For example, the Consul General in New York, he voted in a double envelope. How do you call it in English?
A special package.
Absentee ballot. So only people who are on a government mission can vote from. So yes, so around 800,000 Israelis did not vote because they are abroad.
And in terms of COVID, the Israeli airport was closed for a long time because of COVID in our attempt to limit the spread of the disease, the pandemic here. And there were several appeals to the Supreme Court, also by Israel Beitenu, to open the airports, and they were indeed opened before the elections. There were less Israelis abroad than usual. So actually 100,000 more there were 100,000 more Israelis in Israel able to vote than usually because people travel less. And I don't see, with the current numbers that I see, I don't see an impact of COVID on the COVID restrictions on election results. We had voting buses specifically for COVID patients could come and vote, and could come and vote in special ways. So I don't think that the pandemic right now impacted the elections. Obviously, the economic situation around COVID is something that may have depressed the turnout for Netanyahu.
So in terms of showing the money, I'm going to go back to that again for a moment. Is there a chance at all that one of the Orthodox parties might be enticed to join? They used to be happily sitting in left-wing coalitions. Is there a chance that they could see the writing on the wall that Netanyahu's ability to form governments is weakening with each election, and that it's in their interest to shift a bit?
So the strengthening of the Kahanist party came at the expense of the ultra-Orthodox parties. There's a lot of anger in the ultra-Orthodox community, or at least amongst the ultra-Orthodox politicians, for Netanyahu for supporting the Kahanists in a way that they feel hurt them. So there may be a move there, but I think that that's complicated. The ultra-Orthodox parties have long-standing disagreement with Lapid. It will be hard for them to sit with Meretz, and we need all of the components together. But it's certainly one of the possible scenarios. It's less likely than it's certainly less likely than a fifth election, which is the most likely scenario, and it's less likely than the Arab Party joining one of the blocs.
So then, speaking of the fifth election, a number of questions in the chat really reflect this. Is the Israeli polity seeing the breakdown of the political system and getting frustrated? Would people be open to a reform of this political structure?
So both sides are calling for reform. I mean, both sides want to change the system in their favor. But I don't think that there's a wide agreement on what reform would look like. But I think that the questions are insinuating that we're in a deadlock, and how would we ever get out of this deadlock? We could be having election after election after election and seeing the same result. The result of this election, 59 to 61, is the same as the elections we had a year ago. There's no change. We voted again, we got the same results. Why would we have different results in September? It's unclear. But Netanyahu is eager to stop the trial, and the anti-Netanyahu camp, people in the chat said, I shouldn't call it left, center, left. That's very true. There are right-wing elements in that camp as well. It's the, let's call it the Democratic camp, which is against the reform in the justice system that Netanyahu is advocating. So the Democratic camp is hoping that as the trial continues, the support for Netanyahu will erode. I think that that's the kind of what both sides have to gain.
So then I want you to be future tea readers and guess the future, which is already dangerous. If the Netanyahu does not succeed in avoiding trial, and he becomes, as our past president has been, although it takes people a while to accept, a has-been in the political system, could you see Likud breaking away from the Orthodox and uniting with a secular center-left or center-right government? Do you see a change up? Is his personality been so strong, but that really in other areas, it seems like Likud and Yesh Atid and Kol Lavan really aren't so different in terms of their policies?
When I want to know the future, I always ask Anat.
And I want to ask you about another option that Netanyahu has, and that is to run for president of Israel. The president is elected for 7 years, and he's immune from prosecution.
It's amazing.
I don't think that he will. I don't think that he will run for that. But again, I think that new coalitions will be able to be formed after Netanyahu is gone, which he will be at some point. He is 70-something. He's not going to live
71.
forever. He's what?
71.
In our system, that's a young president for Americans.
Yeah. And I think that will open different options. As the commentator in the Q&A mentioned, if we're looking at it from a simple left-right perspective, the right has gained tremendous strength in the Israeli political system in terms of the mandates, in terms of the percentage of Knesset members that they have. The left lost a lot and the right gained a lot. But what that really means will, I think, be heavily dependent on who the successor for Netanyahu is, and as always, Israel is impacted by global issues, the global trends for democracy or anti-democracy, the U.S. administration. It all has a very deep impact.
Well, for us, the Religious Action Center in America, and I'm sure the Israeli Religious Action Center as well, is about the best of our values. And is there a way for you, are you making any penetration into what people call the right in terms of accepting pluralism, of making changes that aren't about the conflict, but are about the other parts of the soul of what Israel should be? What are you able to do to, and is what you're doing it being accepted by Ashkenazi Jews, but not Yehudei Mizrach? What's the penetration going on in that as you strategize for the future of the work you're doing?
As I said, we work with all parties, and certainly under the leadership of Israel Beiteinu and also Gidon Sa'ar, these are very right-wing parties. They're very committed to, Israel Beiteinu is super committed to the separation of religion and state. They're for many of the liberal values that we espouse. Gidon Sa'ar, who is also very right-wing, has been an advocate for Jewish pluralism for a long time. So there's definitely work that we can do on both sides of the aisle. We don't have aisles in the same way, but using that idiom. So there's definitely work that we can do to promote our issues and our values in terms of the strength of our movement, and in terms of the Orthodox monopoly that we aim to dismantle, and in terms of just the general equality and democracy in Israel. I think that the overarching long-term impact of that will be the more opening of the divide between the different sides of the camp, and the question of the conflict, which is a huge question, is not as central in the Israeli discourse as it is in the discourse of diaspora Jews. Israelis speak a lot more about internal issues than they speak about the conflict. Actually, if I'm thinking about all of the interviews that candidates gave before the elections, I've probably heard 200 hours of interviews. I would be surprised if 5% of the questions and the answers were about the conflict. Israelis are focused on internal issues, and specifically on the Netanyahu issue.
So Merav Mihaly was able to bring labor up from the dead a little bit, but it was the dominant party or coalition of the liberal parties. Will she be able to do more, or is labor still really on life support?
I can only tell you that I think the world of Merav Michaeli, she did a phenomenal job. The Labor Party was under the threshold by a mile when she took over. She's a 51-year-old feminist. She's from Tel Aviv. She doesn't believe in marriage. In Israel, this is revolutionary. She lives in an apartment right next to a very famous comedian, Leo Schlein, who is her not husband, but partner, because she doesn't believe in this institution altogether. And there's something she does that it's hard to explain to non-Hebrew speakers, but in Hebrew, one of our poets said that we have a sex maniac language. Everything has a gender. This glue stick, it has a gender. This mouse, it has a gender. The table has a gender. Breasts have a gender, and it is male. Everything has a gender. Mirav Michaeli speaks to everyone as if they're female. And that is, in the beginning, was a cause of such ridicule. And now it's entered the language, it's penetrated. She actually notices that there are females in the crowd at all times. And that language of hers is revolutionary. And her leadership is fun, it's different, it's ideological. She sounds authentic and true, and she is. And look at Labor, they did so well. And Gilad Kariv is right there as her number 4.
So I want to come back to the change in the American administration and how close Netanyahu came to forming a very, very right-wing government. That's a maximalist government. Is he, for the sake of his own skin, suddenly putting Israel's train on the wrong tracks into a head-on collision with a newly revived Democratic Party that really is not going to have much tolerance for this behavior? And that Israel is no longer a bipartisan issue in America. How do you respond to that disaster possibly happening? Anat, you often talk about American Jewry finding our voice. Is anyone listening?
First, let me compliment you on the question. You phrased it beautifully. And I'm speaking now to a Trump supporter, and maybe among our listeners here, there is a Trump supporter. And I want to say that something about friendship. The best friend is the person that tells you the truth. And the problem with Trump and Netanyahu, that were separated at birth, is that Trump spoiled us. He let Israel take everything it wants. He's allowed everything that our worst impulses were catered to. And it didn't do good for Israel. This is not what friends do. So I am delighted that now there is a responsible adult that will make Israel act like our age, and we're 73. We should act like people are getting Social Security. No, what do you think?
I also think that that's a great question, and it's important to bear in mind, both in terms of the global questions of democracy, but also very specifically, we had a historic victory in terms of our conversion cases just earlier this month. And the ultra-Orthodox parties have said that their condition for coming into government is a law that will bypass that win and threaten all of our achievements. So this is a very real question, the divide between the Jewish North American community and Israel, and maybe the Jewish community and the diaspora in general. I think that when a person Netanyahu is in fight or flight mode, he will do anything. He is not making any calculation that is not about his own political survival right now. That's my analysis of his behavior. There's no interest that is above him avoiding prison time.
Wow. So a question that I'll combine is, and then we'll have you do last statements, and I think Anat, you have a prayer. We need a prayer, let me tell you, is what's happening with the population of the country, and how will that affect the political future? Is the country still very young at this point? Are the ultra-Orthodox growing in size, and that they ultimately will take over democratic, just by means of the democratic process majority? What do you see happening, or are things stable?
Israel is a very young country. I can look up the data but it's very young, and the strongest growing faction is the ultra-Orthodox community. They by far have more children than any other faction in any other section of the community, and that has long-term implications both in terms of politics, in terms of economy, and we believe that this growth of the ultra-Orthodox community, because is not sustainable long-term, both from internal reasons, for internal reasons, and for economic reasons for Israel. So I think that the entire political spectrum in Israel is watching this community where children are not taught core curriculum and men do not work, with a great sense of worry. But we need to remember that even though this is a growing community, they are 12%. So even if they grow by 1% in the next 2 years, which is a lot, that still means that there's an overwhelming majority of other Israelis who are not ultra-Orthodox, who have to think about how we create new political systems.
And I'd like to remind you that in every ultra-Orthodox family, there are children who are leaving the ultra-Orthodox way of life, and that half of all the ultra-Orthodox are girls and women. And the girls are taught core curriculum, and the women are turning to us and fighting against segregation and silencing in the public sphere. I think the ultra-Orthodox are changing. I think that's what worries the rabbis so much. They're very worried, and they're right to be worried, because their population is changing right in front of them.
Wow. Well, fascinating to hear from both of you. I don't know if you'd like to make some closing words. I do want to say, everyone out there, it is so important to support the work of these two heroic leaders, that they are making changes, that we can see it in our lifetimes, that Gilad Karib is in the Knesset. That is amazing. That the issue of conversion, acceptance, all of that going forward, it's because the dogged, tireless work, anvil-carrying women with a smile that we have in these two leaders is so important. And our support for their work is when Anat says, what can you do? That's one of the most important things. So go ahead, and Noah, why don't you close us up?
So first of all, I want to thank you all for bearing with us. I know that this is very confusing, and that Israel is in such an uncertain state, and will continue to be in an uncertain state for a while, at least a year or so. And we ask you to bear with us as we live through this uncertainty, and have faith that we are on the side of justice. We're committed to this work. We're all in together, and we will be able to save Israel and to save the Israeli democracy. This is the struggle of our lifetime. This is why we're here. This is what we're going to do together. We're launching on April 15th, which is Israel's 73rd Independence Day. We're launching a campaign for Iraq's work with the new Knesset. It's certainly going to be a challenge, and we are counting on your support and your help to make the most out of this opportunity and help us protect Israeli democracy.
Wonderful. I see a prayer. Rabbis like prayers.
So this is a prayer for Israel that Anat wrote. Anat, will you read it for us?
Yes. Okay. Eli, in this sacred moment, give us hope for Israel and her future. Renew our wonder at the miracle of the Jewish state. In the name of the pioneers who made the deserts bloom, give us the tools to cultivate diversity of Jewish expression in Israel. Yes. In the name of the fallen soldiers, give us the courage to stand up to the words and ways of zealots, those in our own midst and those among our neighbors. In the name of the Israeli inventors who have amazed the world with their inventions, with innovations, help us apply the same ingenuity to finding a path to peace. In the name of all these women and men, grant us strength to conquer doubt and despair in Israel, replacing doubt with action replacing despair with hope. And let us say amen. And thank you, Jonathan.
Amen. Thank you,
Jonathan.
everybody. Thank you so much. Happy Passover, everyone. Eat a lot of matzah. Think about being free. The central teaching of Judaism, freedom with responsibility of values. That's what Iraq does for us. Thank you, Anat and Rabbi Noah Sattath. You are amazing.
Thank you,
All
Rabbi.
the